Hello, and welcome to Nightmare Masterclass. My name is David Stockdale. I'll be your host on this excursion into the dark unknown. This is the first installment of a multi-part analysis, in which I'll be covering the mysterious video series, Petscop. In this installment, I'll cover videos 1 through 3, and the rest of the videos will be covered in subsequent installments. And I've got to say, this is the series that almost broke me. There is so much going on in Petscop, and I've had some major trouble even beginning to present my findings in an orderly fashion. I can only hope that I do the series justice. So yeah, here goes nothing. Petscop is a video series that documents the experiences of Paul, our unsuspecting protagonist, as he plays through an unknown and seemingly unfinished PS1 game, the enigmatically titled Petscop. The series takes the form of an all-too-familiar YouTube format, the Let's Play, in which a vlogger provides commentary as they perform a walkthrough of any given video game. As Petscop progresses, Paul's experiences become increasingly strange and disconcerting. Let's stop for a minute just to appreciate the sheer amount of effort that went into this project, because this is nothing like your average Let's Play. Petscop is a piece of art that uses the Let's Play format as a plot device in order to tell a very compelling story. And it's a carefully manicured narrative based on an entirely fabricated game. An entire video game filled with unique characters and bizarre settings was designed for this one project alone. That's true dedication. This is the kind of innovative, totally out of left field and dark storytelling that is perfect material for Nightmare Masterclass. I'd like to give a quick shout out to the Petscop subreddit, and I'd also like to thank the faithful custodians of the Petscop Google Doc, the findings of which have apprised this analysis substantially. Links are in the video description. My format's going to be a little different this time around. I'm going to go through the videos point by point, explaining my understanding of the events over the course of the series. And occasionally I'll be interrupting the explanation to point out something that I think is noteworthy. And after I summarize the events of Petscop up to current day, I'll present some thoughts to wrap it up. Please do keep in mind that this is just my interpretation, and by no means do I consider myself the final word on the meaning of this artfully incomprehensible series. So if you spot an inaccuracy or think my analysis is totally off base, please let me know. Your feedback is invaluable. I should also note that at the time of this video's creation, I'm not entirely sure whether the series is ongoing or whether it's complete. There seems to be some contention in that regard among Petscop fans. So with that in mind, let's get started. The very first video was uploaded on Sunday, March 12, 2017. The video description is brief. It reads, "This game I found." The video begins with the PlayStation boot up screen, a piece of iconography that's surely familiar for a large portion of the audience. A symbol appears before the game starts. It's the letter G. Now, as you can see here, the negative space inside the G is filled in with white, and because the background is black, the white space stands out. I think it somewhat resembles a fish hook, which is interesting in hindsight. When the logo is revealed in full, we see that the G is extended in a peculiar way, and it's pointing downwards. It would appear that the game's developer is a company called Garalina. The title screen reads Petscop, and there's a copyright notice by Garalina with the year 1997. Footnote. Time seems to be a very important aspect of this series, so I'll be noting each time a specific year is mentioned. I'm sorry if this gets a little tedious for you, but I believe that establishing a timeline is absolutely essential to understanding the series as a whole. Alright, back to the breakdown. Note that the game requires a memory card, which is true of most PS1 games, but here's an unknown variable. We don't know how much of the game Paul has played prior to the creation of this video. Now, when the game reads the memory card, each of the 3 profile slots show up as empty. So, it's clear that Paul is starting a new game. Paul explains that the purpose of this video is to show the viewer that this game is real. It's not clear who exactly Paul is addressing, but one might assume based on the context that it's a friend, someone he's told about his experience finding this strange old PS1 game. And at this point, we're also not even sure where the game came from. It's just something Paul found. Footnote. I'm going to jump straight to the point and say that what we are witnessing can be thought of as a new kind of digital folklore. Let's consider these opening remarks in such a context and see where it leads us. Many urban legends, such as that of creepypasta lore, begin with an assurance that what the audience is about to hear is entirely true. This, I think, is the central purpose of Paul's interaction with the off-screen unknown character. That character kind of represents the audience. In the context of the story, Paul's trying to convince a friend that the game is real. Paul's efforts in these regards serve a couple of functions. On one level, his efforts establish a certain kind of pseudo-authenticity, highlighting the immediacy of the viewing experience. We can consider these videos as Paul's testimony, or perhaps his account of events that have transpired. But his efforts to convince an off-screen character of the game's authenticity also function as a kind of red flag for anyone familiar with the creepypasta genre. These narrative levels become all the more impressive when you realize the significance of the game's name. More on that later. When Paul begins to enter his name, there's a key for the buttons at the bottom of the screen. X is select, the start button is to finish the entry, and the triangle button is to go back. But if you take a closer look, you'll see that the triangle is fluttering in a way that the other buttons aren't. Is the game trying to tell him to go back? Perhaps this is a warning. Notably, the start button is associated with the word finish, which makes sense in the context of finishing his file entry. However, considering that the fluttering triangle button could be construed as a warning, perhaps the start button also has a certain ominous connotation. Perhaps the game is suggesting that if Paul starts this game, he will be finished by it. The loading screen depicts a gift box held up by a support beam. This imagery reoccurs throughout the first portion of the game. Paul enters what is called the gift plane. The background is entirely white, and in addition to a number of gifts, a few clouds can be seen in the distance. Paul is greeted by a sign which states that the gift plane has closed indefinitely, and all personnel have left. The sign goes on to state that the gift plane once provided homes to over 100, quote, young pets. A total of 48 remain. Note that the number 48 is fluttering in the very same way that the triangle on the start screen was, except that the number is red. The sign encourages the player to visit their 8 homes in the gift plane and, quote, find some friends to take home with you. Again, the number 8 is fluttering. Paul demonstrates to the viewer that the game is unfinished. The path leading straight ahead goes nowhere. Paul enters a pink building labeled Even Care, which he presumes to be the first level of the game. Paul notes that, quote, this is actually not the interesting part. Even Care is plastered with 2 flower symbols on both sides of the building. The symbol reappears inside the building. And further note that the yard is filled with evergreen trees. Paul enters Even Care, and there's a picture on his left depicting 2 characters that reoccur throughout the series. Toneth, whose name appears in red, and Randus, whose name appears in green. Paul attempts to open a door down the hallway to his left, and the game gives him this prompt. This door is locked, or not, but you don't know how to open doors. Paul continues through Even Care, and these signs get increasingly troubling. When you're choosing a pet, pick somebody that you like. You don't have to love them right away. Another sign reads, don't be discouraged if they run from you. They really do want a home. They're afraid. Show them there's nothing to be afraid of. Footnote. Tellingly, one of these signs implicitly grants personhood to these so-called pets. After all, you wouldn't traditionally refer to your dog as, quote, somebody. You wouldn't go to the pound looking for a dog and hear the proprietor say, find somebody that you like. They're far more likely to say, find one that you like. Why is this? Well, it's not that dogs don't have emotions or the capacity to feel pain. They obviously do. It's that we as a society do not grant them the same moral status as people. Now, you can either agree or disagree with this social convention, but nonetheless it's true that we tend to do this. Importantly, this sign seems to indicate otherwise with respect to the pets in the game. Moreover, it seems that in the process of acquiring these pets, fear is the predominant emotional state they experience. They're commonly known to run from the player. According to the sign, they need to be shown that they're not in danger. So it would stand to reason that they've previously been conditioned to think they're in danger. That's a little conspicuous if you ask me. Back to the video. The very first pet Paul comes across is named Amber. She takes the form of something akin to a bowling ball with a hat on. Amber is extremely reluctant to be captured by Paul. She jumps from side to side of the cell, avoiding Paul at every turn. That is, until Paul gets into the cell and locks it behind him, at which point she comes right to him. Paul's able to exit the cell by traversing across an unseen pathway. So it would appear that Paul has tricked this pet into getting close by insinuating that they weren't going to leave the cell. Paul treats this situation as a puzzle to be solved, and in a way, that's true. It was required of Paul to employ logic and deductive reasoning to acquire Amber, but an element of deception was also required. Keep this in mind, because it's a conundrum that will reoccur throughout this creepy video series. Now, once Paul catches Amber, he's able to read her description. Amber is a young ball. She's afraid to leave home. If her home is good, this is not a problem. She is very heavy, and that makes her life a little harder, as well as yours. What's the safest place you can put her in? You should start thinking about that. Well, if Amber's actions are any indication, she seems to think that the safest place for her is in a prison cell. It really begs the question, what kind of situation must Amber be in to think that imprisonment is the preferable option? Footnote. I can't help but think of the Amber Alert in relation to this first pet. This is an alert system used in the United States when a child goes missing. I'm not sure if there's a direct correlation here, but in consideration of certain events that take place later in the series, I think it's worth noting here. Back to the game. In the following scene, Paul isn't able to figure out how to catch another pet. It seems to float over him as he approaches, always just out of reach. However, he is able to catch a few other pets by solving a couple of additional puzzles. Paul catches one pet by stepping onto a treadmill, which adjusts a keyboard that allows his clone to acquire the pet. I know, it's very convoluted. Notably, Paul has to set the keyboard to the number 7 in order to catch this one. Paul doesn't read the description for his pet. Instead, he moves on to the next part of the game. In this section, a flower pops up in 2 different portions of the screen. Each time the flower surfaces, a rain cloud appears over it. As it turns out, both of these entities are indeed pets. Paul moves the bucket to the lower left-hand portion of the screen, and it fills up with rainwater. This subdues the flower and dissipates the cloud. Paul is able to catch both pets as a result. Paul returns to the pet he previously wasn't able to catch. Now, according to Paul, when he found the game, it was accompanied by the following note. I walked downstairs, and when I got to the bottom, instead of proceeding, I turned to the right and became a shadow monster man. 6/13/97. For you. Please go to my website on the sticker, and also go to Ronith's room, and press start, and press down, 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 right, start. Footnote. Again, the year 1997 comes up. Oh, and in case you were wondering, June 13th, 1997 was a Friday. Friday the 13th. Interesting that. Keep this part of the note in mind because it will become relevant later on. As of yet, Paul hasn't mentioned the website that the note directed him to. It's safe to assume that this bizarre-looking creature here with the bird head is Ronith, which makes sense considering that he kind of looks like a hybrid between Tonith and Randus. Paul enters the code, and suddenly the music stops. When Paul leaves Even Care, he enters a darkened, seemingly empty plane. Paul explains that he hasn't been able to find anything in this area, but then the video abruptly cuts ahead. One might assume that Paul edited this footage for the viewer's convenience. Paul says that he previously searched this area for over an hour and found nothing. And yet now, on camera, he's found this wooden hatch within 15 minutes. He attributes this to luck. Footnote. Paul attributes much of what happens in the game to mere circumstance. It will be increasingly difficult to do as the game progresses. Paul explains that he hasn't been able to figure out how to open the door, and if the viewers found any potential clues as to how to open it, he would like to know. Video 1 ends there. The second video was published on April 1st, 2017. There's no description. Video 2 picks up where the first one left off. Paul is waiting in a darkened field next to the hatch. After about 20 seconds or so, a strange jingle plays, and the door opens. The video cuts ahead, and Paul explains that he was away from the game when this happened. He can't account for why the door suddenly opened, but nonetheless, he sure is eager to explore what's inside. Paul traverses down a flight of stairs into a large, darkened room. He finds what I can only assume is a furnace. It's shaking, which would suggest that it's still in operation. And there appear to be various pictures of clocks on the far right side of the room. Paul exits to the left and walks down a hallway, collecting gifts as he goes. Footnote. Now, here's a game mechanic that I think serves a specific narrative function. Paul collects gifts as he explores new areas of the game. The presence of gifts is a good indication to the viewer that what Paul is seeing is new to him. It's new to us as well. As such, the viewer is given the impression of immediacy. Moreover, we can see a number of gifts Paul has collected in the upper left-hand part of the screen. This number can be considered an indication of Paul's progress in the game. That is, of course, if we assume that collecting the gifts is a good thing, and that progress is a thing to be made in this game. These are assumptions. Okay, back to the game. Paul's attention is directed to a ringing phone. He walks into what appears to be an office area and answers the phone. A prompt reads, "Care has left the room." Note that the word care is in yellow text. Paul looks at a sign on the wall, and if you're a fan of Petscop, you probably already know what it says. There are 3 symbols, each of which appear to depict a girl's face. They're increasingly frazzled in each subsequent symbol. She's covering her eyes in the third one. The letters A, B, and NLM correspond respectively to each of the 3 symbols. Paul continues onward down a large corridor. To his left, he finds nothing. He walks out of view and comes back empty-handed. However, when Paul explores in the other direction, he finds a large picture. It displays a small green house. Paul moves on and finds another picture. It depicts a 3-story building constructed of brick. An ominous noise plays as Paul looks at this picture. Paul then finds a third picture that displays a windmill. Footnote. Paul doesn't seem to think much of these pictures. He breezes through this part of the game, progressing in a somewhat compulsive fashion. Moreover, Paul doesn't even seem to notice the car that speeds by at this point in the game. Or if he does, he doesn't seem to think it's particularly noteworthy, despite the fact that it's the fastest moving object he's seen in the game thus far. At this point, Paul apologizes for not talking much. He admits to being a little bewildered by these findings. Paul then finds a strange-looking tombstone which reads, Michael Hammond, 1988 to 1995. Mike was a gift. This is especially ominous considering that gifts seem to be a reoccurring symbol in this game. Note that the name Michael Hammond is in pink. For what it's worth, Michael Hammond would have been 7 years old at the time of his death. This game is taking a dark turn. Footnote. Quite a few people have researched the name Michael Hammond in reference to any morbid sort of events that might have occurred in the years from 1988 to 1995. But I think the name Michael Hammond might be an allusion to something else. I researched the name Michael Hammond and found a professor by that name at the University of Arizona. He's a linguistics professor. Now, in 1988, he wrote a book along with Michael P. Noonan called Theoretical Morphology, Approaches to Modern Linguistics. And interestingly, in 1997, he contributed to a book called Optimality Theory, an overview. He wrote an article called Optimality Theory and Prosody. Now, yes, I am an English major, but linguistics is far from the scope of my knowledge. However, I did do a little cursory research on optimality theory, and to sum it up, it's a specific linguistic model which proposes that observed forms of languages arise from interaction between conflicting constraints. Now, like I said, I'm a little outside the scope of my knowledge here, but I think the emphasis on conflicting constraints is important. Prosody is a term that refers to the patterns of rhythm and sound used in poetry. At this point, you might be wondering, why is any of this relevant? Well, just wait till the end of this video. I think it might start making sense. Okay, back to the video. Both the tombstone and the building next to it have a conspicuous-looking pair of eyes on them. Paul walks into the building and finds a giant flower popping up out of the ground. He picks some of the petals off the flower, and it gradually sinks into the ground each time he does so. Paul stops himself just before removing all of the petals. He goes into the lower level of the building, and we see the very same girl from the sign. She has her hands over her face, just in the same way she was depicted previously, next to the letters NLM. Paul goes back to the upper level and picks all of the petals off the flower. It sinks into the ground entirely. Paul returns to the lower level to find that the girl has been lowered to the ground, but her face is reddened and distorted. Paul isn't able to catch her in the same way he caught the other pets. He passes through her entirely. Footnote: there is yet another strange anomaly that Paul doesn't seem to notice. At 6 minutes and 16 seconds into the second video, Paul's feet are obscured by some unknown translucent object. Check it out. I've slowed down the footage so you can see what I'm talking about. The lower portion of his body disappears. Back to the narrative. Paul again expresses his bemusement at this whole situation and explores the side of the building. He goes down a narrow pathway and into another structure. This one has a number of drawings on the wall, the most pertinent of which being a blue pointed object that repeatedly appears. Take a look for yourself. There are a few other signs, each with something written on them, but as of yet, I haven't been able to discern what they say. They might be totally illegible. Paul continues and sees a giant pointed object, very similar to the one consistently depicted in the drawings, except this one is red. It prompts Paul to ask a question. He asks, "What?" And the object returns with, "I don't know." The message spins around the object as if to taunt Paul. He laughs to himself, as if he should have known better than to expect anything more specific. Paul goes behind the object and the windmill appears. Paul attempts to walk away and the object implores him to, quote, "keep watching the windmill." He reluctantly obliges this request, and we hear a couple of ominous noises. The video cuts forward again. Paul explains that he waited there for a couple of minutes and nothing happened. He starts to wrap up, explaining to the viewer that he'll continue to provide updates. Footnote: who is Paul talking to here? Paul is directly addressing a specific person, someone he's clearly familiar with. He alludes to that person coming home the following month, though it's not clear if he's referring to his place of residence specifically, in which case I'd speculate that the person he's talking to is perhaps an older sibling, or rather, if he's referring to a general region, in which case it could perhaps be a friend who is away at college or something along those lines. If we assume these videos were uploaded shortly after the time of their creation, the timeline would suggest that perhaps the person Paul is addressing is indeed away at school. After all, video 2 was uploaded on April 1st, 2017, so the following month would be May, a time when the spring semester wraps up for many universities. Notably, Paul alludes to the person not being particularly enthusiastic about coming home. The larger point here is that Paul is apparently not intending for this video to be released to a wide audience. This is clear based on the way he's addressing one specific person. So why is the video on YouTube? Perhaps this was the easiest means to convey his message, but then why make the video public? You can privately share videos with other people on YouTube. Why has this been released to the public? Back to the video. Paul enters another room, and it's divided up such that his mirror image is presented on the left side of the screen. But one thing's noticeably different. The mirror image of Paul's avatar has a different face with a plastered-on smile. The mirror image follows his movement patterns, but there appears to be a slight lag at various points. Again, we hear the jingle that played when the door opened at the beginning of this video. Paul takes note of a sign on the right side of the room. It contains backwards text. Paul explains that the note reads, "Do you remember being born?" He also notes that the text on the ground reads, "Quitter's Room." And noticeably, Paul's on the reverse side of this room. The text on his side is backwards, while the text on the left side is normal. Paul leaves the area and ends up back in the darkened field where he started. The third video was published on April 2nd, 2017, just a day after the second video was published. Again, there's no description. Paul is a little more talkative towards the beginning of this entry. He's eager to show us a new area. Paul continues collecting gifts, and this is perhaps a good indication that what we're seeing is Paul's first experience with this part of the game. Paul begins the tour by showing us a giant display plastered on the wall. It reads, "Good grief and alas." Footnote: this is an explicit reference to the Dr. Seuss title, Daisy Head Maisie, in which a girl, Maisie, grows a daisy out of her head. Towards the end of this book, the protagonist begins crying. She yells out the words, "Nobody loves me," prompting many to suspect that the letters NLM on the sign in video 2 stand for, you guessed it, nobody loves me. As for what this means in the grand scheme of things, well, we'll get to that soon enough. At this point, it would suffice to say that there's a certain rather ominous theme beginning to develop. Back to the video. Paul continues onward and happens upon a brick building with a window-like enclosure. It appears to operate in the fashion of a turnstile. Paul suspects that he's supposed to put something in there. He is then challenged by a strange puzzle on a canvas, one that entails various combinations of eyes, eyebrows, and noses. He selects a pattern and the ground begins shaking. Paul is taken aback by this. It's beginning to dawn on him that this hidden area is actually a whole game, and it's one that he's become fully immersed in. He leaves the room and subsequently resets the puzzle. Paul selects a new pattern. The video cuts forward and Paul deduces that he's supposed to wait out the earthquake. Paul enters a bedroom. The carpet has a pattern with teddy bears, PS1 controllers, and stars. There's a magic 8-ball on the table, along with a red model car. There is a shadowy figure sitting on the bed. It's completely still. The pattern Paul previously selected is shown on a cabinet above the table. Paul explores the room and finds nothing much of note. He leaves, selects a new pattern, and enters the bedroom again. This time, the carpet pattern contains clown faces and flowers. There's a Rubik's Cube on the table, and a cute little Pez dispenser with a teddy bear head on the top. Paul figures that the room variations are generated in some way based on the different sorts of patterns he selects in the puzzle. But there's a catch. With each subsequent pattern selection, Paul has to wait a considerable amount of time before he's able to enter the bedroom generated by the game. So he's only able to show us a few different variations. Paul shows us a green bedroom with a Game Boy and, again, a model car on the table, along with a new carpet pattern. This one exclusively features PS1 controllers. He shows us another variation, a bedroom with a purplish hue. The room features a bottle of Play-Doh and, again, a Rubik's Cube on the table. The carpet features a series of orange circles and triangular shapes, as well as the same teddy bear face we've seen previously. Footnote. You might be wondering what's going on with all the Rubik's Cubes, teddy bears, game controllers, and model cars. Well, I think two major thematic motifs are starting to take shape: childhood and puzzles. Back to the game. Paul calls to mind the face pattern on the gravestone, the one belonging to Michael Hammond. He enters that same pattern on the canvas and goes into the resulting bedroom. The product is a room tinted in red. The carpet has a pattern containing that familiar clown face, a pair of glasses, and a few other shapes. Notably, there is no figure on the bed this time. There's also a pair of tweezers on the table, though Paul can't seem to identify it. In addition, the table has another more conspicuous item. It's a miniaturized version of that same object previously depicted in the drawings. The very same object that prompted Paul to ask a question in video 2. Paul enters another pattern, the one previously seen on the brickling next to the tombstone. He gets a message. Care is missing. You may visit her room. This pattern generates a room devoid of color, save for the very same pointed object on the table, as well as a set of crayons. The carpet has a pattern with daisies and paint rollers. Again, there's no figure sitting on the bed this time. And there's a rather disconcerting note on the wall. It reads as follows. Your wife says, care isn't growing eyebrows. Note that the word care is in yellow. You say, that's a puzzle. Note that the word puzzle is in green, and the text is fluttering. You're secretly very excited to hear this news. You're in the bathtub thinking about her. I have a guess at which child you'll pick next. When you find her room, the passage to my right will lead to her. She'll appear from the darkness, limping, and I'll shoot her in the head. What am I reading? Paul asks. Tiara says young people can be psychologically damaged, quote, beyond rebirthing. The words tiara and also rebirthing are in purple, and the purple text is fluttering. A young person walks into your school building. They walk in with you. You're holding their hands. They come out crying into their hands because nobody will love them. Not ever again. Nobody loves me. Note that this text is in yellow. They wander the Newmaker Plain. Okay, so Paul is clearly confused about this note, but he recalls the note that he received along with the game, the one that said, for you. Paul speculates that the you in the first note is the very same you in this note. Paul wonders if the game was perhaps intended for someone specifically, but he assures the viewer that it wasn't meant for him personally. Paul then continues exploring another part of the game, but finds that the space is entirely blank. He walks off the screen for a bit and then comes back into frame. And that's the end of video 3. One final important point that I want to hit in this first video is that Petscop works in some ways as a meta-narrative. That is to say, it can be seen as a story about stories. On the surface level, Petscop is a story about a kid who receives a mysterious game and gradually becomes ensnared by it. But on another level, Petscop is about how the medium of a story can be used to subvert certain tropes and illuminate the human condition in ways that other mediums can't. Particularly, Petscop works to illuminate the lived experience of an abused child. I mean, that should be fairly obvious at this point. But the meta-narrative aspect is important, because stories are how we make sense of the world. Now, let's discuss the meaning of the name Petscop. This is an oddly specific jumbling of words, so I'm thinking there's some deeper significance here. But then again, you could say that about pretty much anything Petscop related. This is going to be an esoteric and somewhat discursive point, but I think it's one worth exploring. It's been suggested that the name Petscop is a portmanteau of two certain words. We'll get into that in a minute. But first, for reference, a portmanteau is a linguistic blending of words. Essentially, it's a word that combines both the sounds and the meanings of two other distinct words. For instance, the term motel is a combination of the words motor and hotel, which makes sense considering that a motel is essentially a hotel designed specifically for motorists. Interestingly, the term creepypasta is itself a portmanteau, serving as a play on the term copypasta, which is itself a portmanteau of the terms copy and paste. Is this confusing enough for you yet? My underlying point is that this playful yet ominous wordplay seems to have some kind of thematic significance in Petscop. If we consider the term Petscop as an artistic combination of both sounds and meanings, we just might be able to glean some basic understanding of where all this is going. Now, that's a big if, but stay with me here. There are two elements we need to discuss. So, we know the word pet refers to a domesticated animal, like a cat or a dog. That one's pretty clear. Though what's not clear is what the word pet actually means in the context of the name Petscop. But I digress. For now, let's focus on the Old English word scop, because this is one that is a little more complicated. According to a history of oral interpretation, the word scop is an Old English term used to refer to a certain kind of poet. A scop was typically attached to a specific court, in the same way we might think of a court jester serving at the pleasure of a particular king. It seems to me that the medium is rather important in this context. A scop is thought to have relayed their poetry through the oral tradition. It is said that they often recited recognizable stories, such as that of old pagan legends originating from Germanic tribes. But they also composed their own original works, depending on what the situation called for. For instance, a scop might have composed a eulogy to pay tribute to their deceased master. But, importantly, there's some contention about the historical accuracy of this term and the way it's used. Professor Seth Learer suggests that perhaps the distinctly oral quality of Old English poetry was itself a kind of fiction. Perhaps the Anglo-Saxon oral poet, this so-called scop that is the point of our discussion, never really existed in the first place. Yes, there is an oral quality to certain works, Beowulf being the most well-known among them. But there's not much in the way of historical evidence that would indicate that poets actually relayed their stories in this way. The term could have just been a literary device, one that allowed poetry of the time to give the impression of orality and performance. Or at least Professor Learer thinks that's a possibility. This web series is a kind of video manifestation of the creepypasta genre. Moreover, it's a kind of theatrical, fictional iteration of the Let's Play format. So, with this in mind, recall the contention over the term scop, and further recall the argument that perhaps the so-called scop was merely a literary device to give poetic works the impression of orality. This, I think, might just be the function of the term scop in relation to the title of this web series. Think of Petscop's format in this same way. The Let's Play format is just a conduit through which the story is being told. The medium is one that many from our generation are familiar with. It's a modern narrative device used to give the impression of immediacy, and given the tone of Petscop, it's even endowed with a sense of poignancy. And think of Paul in this same way. I believe that he too is merely a conduit, and this will become more and more apparent as the story unfolds. I believe the series itself serves as a meta-commentary on the creepypasta genre and the Let's Play style of vlogging. As we get deeper and deeper into it, we'll see that there's a kind of archetypal path laid out for Paul in the narrative, and due to the format, it's one that we too must reluctantly traverse along with him. Over the course of the next month or so, I'll be releasing subsequent installments relating to the Petscop web series. In the next video, I'll be discussing Paul's scientific outlook and how it relates to the broader themes of the series. I'll also be getting a bit into the character design. In the meantime, I want you to think about something. Think back to the subject of Professor Michael Hammond's paper, Optimality Theory and Prosody. Think about how the rhythm of poetry might be a kind of metaphor that we can use to understand Petscop. After all, things seem to relate to one another in a way that can be said to rhyme in a narrative sense. Moreover, recall this idea of conflicting constraints in relation to optimality theory, and think about how that could possibly relate to the game mechanics of Petscop. Alright, that wraps it up for this installment of Nightmare Masterclass. Thanks for watching, and good night.